Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Doc Bookshop. Thank you for tuning in. I am so excited today because we have two beautiful women here that's going to talk about this wonderful book, Rooted. And we're so excited. Thank you, Brea, for taking time out of her busy schedule. She's actually attending the AKA Boulay conference.
Yes.
Conference. 2024 in Dallas. And we're just so appreciative that you've taken time out to join us here at the Doc Bookshop to discuss her new release, Rooted, with our wonderful friend, Abby. Thank you for the connection, Abby. So I'm going to turn it over to them and let them go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Diane.
Yes, thank you for having me and having us in this conversation. And even just walking around at the dock, I'm like, ooh, okay, this is beautifully curated in here. So I hope everyone here has already been, but please do stop by.
Yeah, and for those of you online, I know some of you guys are not based here, most of you guys are not, but if you ever do come to Fort Worth or the DFW area in general, stopping by the bookshop is a wonderful thing because, you know, as I was telling Brea, it's the largest bookshop, I think, in the southwest of the U.S., the largest Black-owned bookshop. So it's very rare to have a space like this. I've been coming here since I was a kid, and it's just, I think, one of those things that once you get used to it, you don't appreciate it to the same level because it's definitely phenomenal. So, yeah. So, everybody, we have Brea, as has been introduced, and we have her here today to talk about her book, Rooted, The American Legacy of Land Theft and the Modern Movement for Black Land Ownership. And I think one of the biggest things that is so exciting about this is not only the purpose, but kind of what has happened just by the people I know that have read it. So I guess, Brea, first, I want people to get to know who you are. So introduce yourself a little bit, you know, talk about, you know, just who you are as a person, because I feel like that's something that means so much to this kind of thing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Yes, so my name is Brea. I am a writer and an organizer. I first began this work not writing at all. I was just an activist, organizer, young student on a college campus right when the Black Lives Matter movement is starting to really bubble over and boil over. And so I specifically remember that my biggest impetus was the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And watching that happen and feeling like I had so much faith in the criminal legal system to hand over justice and whatever that meant to the family and to us collectively. And that really pushed me to care a lot more about racial justice. And I grew up in New York, so, you know, addressing police brutality felt very natural because we've got NYPD. Sure enough, not just, you know, a year after Trayvon Martin is killed and George Zimmerman is acquitted, do we have the death of Eric Garner and Michael Brown and so many others that turn into this movement. And so a lot of my activism was around policing and prisons and specifically what that looks like in this more like city and suburban context. And I remember just not quite fully rejecting my Southern roots, but not really connecting them to my activist work. And it wasn't until my grandfather passed away, which we'll probably get to later, but that I really started wanting to do more of the genealogical history to understand my ties to the South and what it meant to continue on my elders' activism and not just think that I'm inventing the wheel, but recognizing that I'm continuing something that was started before. So yes, it was a winding journey where I first began working mostly with nonprofits and leading campaigns and things of that nature. And then writing just kept jumping out at me as a vehicle for activism, where I'd be working on a campaign and trying to get media to cover it. And someone would say, why don't you just write an op-ed about it? And they'd give me the opportunity to do that. And that would turn into a series of more opportunities to write commentary and, you know, share calls to actions about issues that matter to me. And slowly writing more and more articles and essays and op-eds turned into, is there a book that I could write about some of these things that are just burning a hole in my heart, that are keeping me up at night? And I'm grateful that One World gave me the opportunity to do that.
I love that. I love that so much. And especially, I remember whenever you first put like Rooted in your bio on Instagram, and I was like, what is that? Like, it's like a little exciting moment, especially because Brea, along with other phenomenal Black women organizers, educators I know in the last year, have like all released books in the last like 4 months. So it's been amazing. Like Dr. Jackson released her book, E.J. Elmer released her book, Stephanie E. Rogers I think just released a new book. So you're kind of like among the elite right now in terms of just being able to like, you know, like put
I love
this
that
kind
I'm in
of
that
thing.
cohort. Thank
Like
you.
y'all are, yes.
Yes, I appreciate you saying that because I do think that there are so few opportunities for Black women authors and writers to be published and to have their work championed. So it's nice to be in a season where that's happening more and more.
Yeah, and to be, I mean, just to kind of put this kind of thing out into the atmosphere. So then I guess in summation, without, you know, giving people too much, what do you think the biggest takeaway is from Rooted coming out of it? And then I want to go back to what do you think is what people should expect going into it. So first going out of it, and then we'll go back to what they should go into
The
it.
biggest takeaway going out of the book. I feel like the biggest takeaway is to think of reparations as a racial justice, an economic justice, but also an environmental justice policy. And I think right now, even other Black people will talk about reparations as if there's no way it can ever happen, as opposed to this thing that we must have in order to get any of the other things that we're seeking. And I think that we need to reframe that, because the idea that we're waiting for someone to let us have it is limiting our ability to really demand what is just required. And there's so much loss and theft that has taken place, and we deserve it, and it is so documented. And I think that there should be an intergenerational movement for us to get this birthright back.
Yeah, I actually want to, on something you talked about when it comes to deserving it. So in the book, you talk kind of about, to me, like what I got was like the process of teaching yourself that you deserve it, not only from like the roots part of connecting with your roots, but from understanding what it does for you as a person, what it does for other Black people. So can you talk a little bit more about that deserving part? Because I think in all the work that we do, feeling like you are entitled to something that is so phenomenal and is such a huge part of history is a big part. So if you could talk a little bit about that in the book.
I love the way that you framed that question. Yeah, I think that that's just an issue in general, is that Black people and other marginalized communities, we have been conditioned to not be entitled and to feel like we don't deserve anything in this country, to accept the bare possible minimum, and to be really proud of the successes that we find in spite of. So we're like, I don't need that handout, you know, I don't even need the reparations, or I don't want people thinking I got the affirmative action. And so then we start leaning into these policies as if they're not things that we have already worked for. So I think that, again, it goes back to this idea of, if our elders and our ancestors already worked and earned these things, and then they should have been passed down naturally and they weren't, then we're not asking for anything other than what is just due. That would have been the inheritance. So I think that deservedness really comes into play, because if you won't even ask for it because you don't believe you should, then even if you got it, you'd feel guilty about it. You'd feel like, oh, I'm taking something from someone else. And so I think it's important that we continue to remind people that we are in what is called the richest country in the world. Mm-hmm. There's no reason that we should not be asking for, I mean, we're not even asking for it with interest. Like, we're asking for like a very discounted version of reparations. So I think we can at least ask for that and not be afraid to ask for that.
That's such an important part. I was thinking, because y'all, I'm trying to keep my books pretty. It's like a whole thing I've been doing as of late, because often when I get a book, I'll take it places will get water stains on it. So I've been buying digital versions and then trying to keep my paper versions pretty, but my phone has to be up there, so I don't have my notes. But I found there was a passage that came to mind when you were talking about that, and it's in chapter 14, A Labor of Love, and you talk about your dad, and in it there's a sentence right here somewhere, right here, where it says, Frank Hill supposedly asked Alfred for a house in a conversation that caused the unspoken tension in their relationship to boil over. Alfred said, I'm not going to put a house there, and you go sell it, and you go lose the house and the land. Frank was furious at being told what to do by his now adult son. And like looking at the tensions in this chapter of your family members, and kind of like the arguments when it came to just like, okay, we're going to put a house on the land. Should we put a house? Okay, if we put the house, we're going to do this. And then this person's going to have it in this will, and kind of all of that. How did that impact you writing the book? Because I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about anything related to Black movements, we either get told to not talk about the different discourse and how we disagree and how to actually come back together from that, or we talk about it in a way where we don't actually learn how to root it in love. And that's this, like, talking about this in the context of love, this whole chapter, towards the end, I think was so amazing. So if you could talk a little about that, because like I said, this was like the arguments was one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite parts.
I feel I tried through the book to dispel the myth that we have to always agree to deserve the things that we're asking for. And I think when we normalize that families will argue, families will disagree, families have different opinions on what to do with the land, and that doesn't need to be a reason that we become dispossessed, that our land gets taken from us. But often rifts and tension within Black families gets preyed upon, and it's like, ooh, great, that's a great time for me to come in. And so, and I think that we have to know that, so that even when I'm disagreeing with family, I'm still going to communicate with family. Right. But yeah, as far as writing the book, most of the tension and the characters, the people that I'm talking about, are not living anymore. And so I think that helped to an extent, that they weren't alive to really reckon with the ways that different people saw them. But in some ways I wish that they were, because my grandfather, when he was alive, really thought of his father as like a weak link of the family. And that was something that he said to us while he was alive. It's something that my grandmother and my dad and his siblings all really reiterated, was he just really felt ashamed that his father let white people take his land. That's how he thought of it. That his dad was too busy drinking and gambling and doing other stuff to be more vigilant of his land. And I wish that he was alive for me to help him understand that his dad was up against so much more than he likely knew. And it was so systematic that to think that his dad as a lone, farmer and landowner was going to go up against the U.S., there was just so much designed to get him off of his land. And I wish he was alive to hear that. But I will say, there was a random moment where I was talking about the book with my family, and one of my living aunts was like, my dad never drank, talking about, and I'm like, ooh. Okay, well, everyone else says he was an alcoholic, so I don't know what to do with that information. But I think ultimately, to me, the point of it is not to vilify him for it; it's to say it doesn't matter. And I think that, to go back to my history with policing that we talked about earlier, is like this idea that we have to be perfect to deserve the things that we're asking for is also something to dispel. And again, I say in the book, there are a lot of drunk white men, gambling white men, not good white men who still have their land. That was never the excuse to push them off of theirs. So it shouldn't be the excuse here. He doesn't have to be a person that you want to have a beer with to say that he didn't deserve what happened to him, and that a lot of Black families don't deserve what happened to them.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. There are so many different facets of what I feel like you just mentioned in here, but especially she has a lot of visuals in the book, and I'm like a really visual learner, and I learn kind of sporadically, so I'll read something that I like and then get excited about a part and then go off and then Google it for like 4 days and then come back. So I really think it's kind of odd, but the visuals were so helpful because so many of them are primary sources. And in it, this one of Le Petit Journal, in which chapter is this?
Chapter 8.
Yeah. I think it's it. Ooh. It's one more.
Yeah,
There
chapter 8, white lashing against Black wealth.
Yeah, and like the visuals are so powerful, and I feel like especially you have had to deal with a lot of visibility in your life with your identity and just like different parts of it. So what in terms of like the visual strength came through you writing this? Because you have all the pictures, you have pictures of your family. I feel like you had to take a lot of time looking at visuals while you were kind of taking them and translating them into this written word. Like, just tell me more about that process, because I feel like that to me is always fascinating, having to go back and forth, especially to something like this, and like seeing how that translates into the real world.
Yeah, the visual she's talking about, it's a political cartoon about the Atlanta riot in 1906. And that chapter was definitely the hardest to be looking at firsthand records of, because the chapter talks about the Wilmington Massacre and how the Wilmington Massacre inspired the Atlanta riot, also a massacre, the Tulsa Massacre, and many others, and how that violence pushed people off of land. So I think that those records were really hard, but there weren't necessarily gory because there wasn't a lot of imagery. There were like a few images of the massacres themselves, but it's more hard because these are political cartoons in very like reputable magazines that are making light of and satirical, and like it just showed how casual the violence was. I think that's the part that was like, they weren't even trying to hide it. Like some of the political cartoons were like, beware of Negro rule, like we ride at dawn. It's like, whoa, it's like, but again, these are on like the front covers of different newspapers and they're in the bifold. Like it was very ever present. And so then the end of the chapter kind of ends with asking people to think about sundown towns as like, these are not naturally occurring places. Like violence like this creates sundown towns, and then they're maintained because people know I ain't never going back there because you heard what they did to them in this year, whatever. So yeah, it was just, but I think it's important to look at them because I know that some people are very avoidant of anything that feels like, you know, trauma porn is that phrase. And I agree with that to an extent. And also I think it's easy to forget how bad some of these moments were, and to think that you would have done something differently, which a lot of younger generations will do. Back then, I would have done this, and I wouldn't let nobody do this. And it's like, you don't know what you would have done when someone knocks on your door and is forcing you out your house in front of your kids with a barrel at you. You know, like you have no idea what you do. And I think it's important to see this kind of stuff to understand that people were being exiled from the only counties and towns they'd ever known. And they weren't leaving lightly. Like it was not passive threats. It was like very visceral, violent, they will act upon it threats. And so when we walk around and like, oh yeah, we used to live in insert place, you know, there's often, that's why people don't want to talk about it. It's often a lot of really horrible violence that pushed that into being. But what I really loved is I was just in Tulsa for the book tour, and I went to the Greenwood Museum, and before you get to the violence, they show all the beautiful businesses and homes that were there. And I think it's important to see it. Sometimes it makes it worse because then it makes it more real what has been taken from people. But like they have a recreated barbershop, like what a Tulsa Black barbershop would have looked like then. And there's like a hologram of a Black barber in there talking, and like you feel like you can see what people were trying to build for their families. And I think when you are confronted with that, it's hard not to fight for restitution. Like there are living Tulsa massacre survivors who are still trying to get restitution, and there are museums about what happened to them, but there's no policy to fix what happened to them. So we're really big on symbolism, but we don't always lean into what can change things.
Yeah, and they recently got denied. So
yeah, exactly. Literally, like a week before I got there. Yeah, it's nuts. And they're 109 and 110 years old, who are survivors themselves. Not my dad was there, my mom was there, my grandpa was there.
I was there.
Mother Randall was like, I believe 7 years old when the massacre happened, is now 110 years old, still petitioning the courts. And these courts, knowing that there are plaques all over Tulsa showing what happened, and still, so it's like offensive when it's like, people, you know, they won't do it.
Yeah, it's rude. They're playing in your face.
Exactly.
With that being said, I feel like I want to move back into talking about kind of how your current life is now, because I didn't realize Brea has chickens. So you inherited 145 acres. How many acres was it?
So I wouldn't say I inherited, but when my grandfather passed away, and then more recently my grandmother, we are all sort of heirs, property owners of the land that they left behind. And then there's some land that's also trusted. So yeah, so I would say about 96 acres total in North Carolina that we have. But I live on about an acre in Atlanta with my wife, Mariah.
And you guys have, you were talking earlier about how like having something as simple as like chickens and everything, especially with your new baby. How old is your baby now?
10 months. God. His Gigi and Auntie are in the back right there.
Oh, hello. Oh my gosh, your little 10-month-old baby boy. Yeah. He's so cute to watch. Like you said, mentioned that having like your like child and like your wife and like, you know, chickens and these other simple like things on land has really just made it much easier to slow down. Like, what does that feel like, especially producing something like this while you're going on a tour? So you're going from place to place and being able to come home and like settle in that. What is that like?
Yeah, I love it. And I didn't think that I would love it because I grew up in New York. So our land in North Carolina was always like, we go in doses, but that was not my life, anything rural or agricultural in any way. And so it was just like slow exposure to things that over time would be, I really look forward to mornings of walking into the backyard and getting that time outside, or getting frustrated and being like, I'm gonna take a walk, and just feeling the like ecotherapy of it, and like the stillness and just slowing down enough, which again, New Yorker. So it's like you don't realize how much gets pent up inside of you. And there's an organization called Girl Trek that does some really good. Yes. Okay. So we got Girl Trek hands up front. Yes. So Girl Trek is so dope, and I don't think their research on this is like public yet. But when I was interviewing some of their team for the book, they were in the midst of doing studies on how access to land and nature extends lifespans specifically for Black people, and how they're considered the largest public health organization that serves Black women in the country. And a lot of their work is just getting Black women to rest, to be out in nature, to slow down a bit, because we're told we got to be twice as good or 3 times as good, and it actually is like burning us out. And nature is a really great way to like reverse a lot of those effects. It's like we heal nature by being good land stewards, and nature then in turn heals us. And also, like, not all of it is, because some people are like, oh, I don't really believe in the like, nature can heal me. But like, even if you're not thinking of it in the more therapeutic mental wellness sense, literally drinking clean water, breathing cleaner air, having food that is free of pests, like all of those things also contribute. So our son has like only had fresh eggs from the chickens in the backyard. That is a beautiful thing to say, but also is like probably really great for his health. So I think that it's important for us to embrace those things. And a lot of times the reasons that we push back against them are also like designed, like for Black people to not want to be in nature. Now that the country cannot profit from us being in nature.
Most definitely. And your wife's a chef. So I imagine that the baby's not just eating good, but is eating like good.
Yes. He does. He eats his rice. Yeah. He eats very, very well.
I love that so much. Well, I want to ask one more question before I let somebody in the audience, or I got to double check and see if folks online have asked any questions. What for you do you want people to look at going into the book? Because I feel like there's a lot that people may have. They may have preconceived notions. They may be excited, but what expectation do you want them to have based on the labor that you put into this, and kind of just what lens they should be looking at this through?
Mm-hmm. You don't have to, you don't have to already be or want to be a farmer to care about what happens to Black people on land. And I think that was something for me, that because I felt very removed from that experience, I was so focused on, again, like how Black people are treated in cities like New York, Oakland. But more than 55% of Black Americans live in the South. States like Texas, right? And those that don't live in the South, still many more of us live in suburbs and rural areas across the Midwest and other states. So just really recognizing that any racial justice movement has to consider that the most Black Americans are in a region that currently doesn't get a lot of visibility when it comes to what racial justice looks like. So I think that that's important for us to branch out. I mean, again, y'all are here in Fort Worth, Texas, so I imagine that that's not lost on you. But I think that it's for those who are tuning in online, or just those who are trying to take up more space in this national conversation, I think it's really important to do so. Because as much as I care about addressing the criminal justice system, if we fixed and abolished prisons and police tomorrow, there would still be a lot more work to do when it comes to Black people having an equitable standing in this country. And reparations is a really great way to bridge racial wealth gaps and do a lot of those things at once. So I really think it's important. Yeah. So going into the book, I just want people to remember that no matter what you see on Netflix or whatever, most Black people do not live in cities like New York, which is shocking to me, but an important truth.
I love that. Oh my gosh, give her a round of applause. This is so amazing. Before I take questions from others, I brought you some peaches. So
Stop. Is this from your family?
Listen, I have some for you as well, Danya and Donna. I literally was like, I'm gonna go pick some peaches this morning, so we had some fun gathering those. So it's been, I was like, I hope she enjoys them because I tried to make sure they were the sweetest ones. And we're gonna be rooted, so we have to be in touch with all of those things.
Oh, thank you.
Did any of y'all have any questions that are here in person while I go and check our social media platforms? You look like you're ready.
I have so many questions. One of them that I have is like when you were talking about the sort of darker history of what really pushed people off of their land and what was forcing this dispossession. I thought that was really kind of cognitively dissonant to what I see on social media these days about like what it looks like to go back to your farm and like you know, there's I think that history doesn't always make it to our modern actions or like our present day actions. And I wanted to know, what do you think is lost when we don't like think about that history, or like what is the value that you found in like engaging with it and really considering it?
Yeah, that's such a good point because it definitely can't be glamorized. I think the main thing that gets like the main risk in not being honest about the history is that we over glamorize it and people don't realize what it takes to maintain your asset. Because across our history in this country, Black people have not had a problem with work ethic. Black people have not had a problem with ambition. It's always, can we hold on to our assets long enough to pass it to the next generation? Or is it going to be snatched from us right at the time that we're supposed to be doing that? And I think that it's important to talk about that so people understand how protected they need to be. I remember having a conversation with my aunt, and this was before I moved to Georgia. So I was still living in New York, a lot of gun control, and my aunt's living in North Carolina, and they have several hunting rifles that they had inherited from my grandfather when he passed away, but also she has her own handguns. And I remember thinking I was going to be, you know, an activist and, Auntie, have you not heard about these mass shootings and we can't have a gun and da-da-da. She said, girl, I am 5'1" and I live on land with me and your grandma and your cousin. There's no way we're not going to be armed. And I think it was important for me to hear that from her and to remember that every state has its own different contexts, and what can work in New York might not work in another state. I'm not saying that to say that I don't support gun control. I very much do. And I also believe in especially Black people's right to self-defense, and recognizing that for a lot of people, being armed has been like their front line of defense against someone who's trying to take their land. And most of the land, like the land that my mother's side of the family lost, was lost very violently. I don't know if a gun being present would have changed that, but I know that we were ran off the land and have not been in Kentucky for the most part since. So I think it's just important to remember that, like, even, you know, there's the protection side, but then working the land is hard, and not, there's not a lot of confirmation that it's going to be profitable. Any number of natural disasters can come in and change a whole season, which if you watch Green Sugar, that sort of gets depicted there. But so I just think it's very real and important to recognize that farming is not going to be a profit-making, get-rich-quick measure for most people unless you have a lot of startup money to like mechanize it, which isn't the goal in my opinion. So I think being able to be honest about that so people know that you're starting slow, that homesteading is not going to turn into, I've got all this livestock and like all these acres of things that I'm growing and I'm not paying anyone to help me with it. Like, it's going to take time, and that doesn't mean that it's not worth it still. I still believe that it's still so valuable to invest your time into, even if that's like really, really small. Because I still don't like to bait my own hook. They know that. And but I'm still out there with the chickens, and I'll still, you know, help to the extent of my capacity. So I think we can, you know, start in the ways that work for our budgets and our time, and recognize too that people would assume, oh, well, you have chickens, so you must never travel, you must never do this. And it's like, look, I can do both things. And we were saying that too, like, yeah, you picked peaches for us, and then you came here in this fine denim outfit. So like, there's duality.
I love that. There's one question online, it actually comes from my own mom. because the rest of them we've addressed, which is wonderful. So I grew up very privileged. I grew up with a dad who's a doctor. Like there was never a question of like finances, anything else. My mom always loved nature, so it was much easier for me to like continue to be tapped in. And I think especially what you're talking about when it comes to understanding like something as simple as like what does gun ownership mean when you're in a place like this? What does it mean to like travel with chickens? So she asked, how do you help people that aren't as privileged as somebody like me, for example, or who may not have had like the stability you've had in terms of being blessed and being able to like really like get connected to these roots in a way that other people may not have as easy access to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's her question, is how do other people that don't know where you're stuff, that don't have any background in this, what should they do to kind of begin?
Yeah, I think start with an organization because I think if you're just getting started, community really helps. Like I wouldn't have been able to do it if there weren't family being like, this is how you do this and you should do that and this is what you buy. And I think community is really helpful for that. So number one, there are so many different groups and organizations depending on what level of nature you're trying to reclaim, whether that's hiking and walks, girl trek, hike club, whether that's like actually wanting to farm and garden. There are places like Soulfire Farm where you can go for sometimes like a week or two at a time and learn how to grow things. Sometimes just for day trips and learn how to grow things. There are a lot of like localized organizations that kind of run their own community farms and they depend on volunteers. So by volunteering, you're learning and also serving the community. And a lot of times volunteers are allowed to bring their own produce home, but it also feeds like community banks. So there's a lot of creative ways, and I would just encourage people to find the one closest to them and do a little Googling, see if there's a chapter of a national organization. And then also for those who are just wanting to do something that's more from home and get tips, there's so many different Facebook groups, Instagram groups, WhatsApp groups, Telegram, Signal groups about this. I'm in a few like it's like Black Chicks with Chicks.
Oh my gosh.
And it's cute, and they have lots of tips and stuff like that they'll post. There's like Black homesteader groups on Facebook with like 50,000 plus people. I'm in like so many of those because I get lots of like, I want horses and my wife doesn't want me to have horses, but I get all my tips from the pages so that when it's time, it's not like I'm coming with can I have a horse? And I don't know. It's like, I know that they need this and they need that. And I know how much it costs. So I'm not, disillusioned about what it's going to look like. Yeah. So
you gonna have a horse.
2 horses because horses are herd animals. I learned that in one of the groups.
Yeah.
So I gotta have 2.
They don't like to be solo. Oh my gosh, she gonna love that. Eventually.
She's good, right? Hopefully. Yes.
Did you already talk about your cover?
I did not know.
I'm just curious. Did you pick the cover? Like, what is this picture about? I mean, is this connected to your?
So this is not like a photo of my family or anything like that.
Okay.
I did not design the cover. I am blessed to have published through One World, and they have art directors on staff who came up with a bunch of different options. And I was struck by this one though, and what pushed me towards it was that I love that there's a Black woman in the center, because a lot of times I feel like you talk about something like Black land ownership and you just picture like men. You just only think of men. And even like this is a room full of Black women, and I think it's important that we remember there's so much intra-community diversity that comes to this conversation, and Black women get invisibilized often. But I remember like also in my family research that people would often, like any of my grandfather's siblings that I would talk about, they'd always talk about their mother's work ethic in the land. That, oh yeah, Grandma Martha would cook everybody breakfast, come out, pick a whole row of cotton, go back inside, cook everybody lunch, and then come out and help her kids with the row. And it's like her kids were like teenage boys. So it's like they were supposed to be on par with their mom, who was a mother of 18 kids. Like, so I just feel like I really loved, I don't even know this woman's story, because what is often the case is with the photography, they don't even have the subject named. But I just loved the strength that she had, and that she's standing in the middle of this field, standing very, very tall. And then I love that the green was just growing out from under it. So they just did a really great job, and I made like 2 slight tweaks to the offering of this and then chose this one. Yeah.
I like
Yeah. No, I love that you asked that. I'm actually very curious what their process was. I feel like I should check in more with the art director.
That's interesting. You could even write like a piece on it, just on that.
I just wanted to do it too. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Are there any other questions? Oh, there you go.
Can Brea quickly, online, there's a book right in front of you. If you could just kind of go through your table of contents I like how you have it broken down with the heights. It's the heights revisited. You just mention it, just go through it online for the audience so we can hear some of this stuff, because I think, and if you want to expound on some of it, you can, but I just think it'd be great if the audience can hear it. Because I'm reading it, but I don't think they.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can read. So the book is broken up into 5 parts. Part 1 is called The Heist, which spends a few chapters on the original land theft, as I call it, which is to acknowledge that this was all indigenous land first and foremost, and it was taken from indigenous people so that we could work it, or our ancestors could work it, and then so that part kind of ends with failed Reconstruction, basically. Like, we have the Civil War, and Black people think, okay, this is gonna be our moment, and then it's like, nope, not quite. But then we get to part 2, and I called it the Phoenixes, because in spite of that, there was us like rising from those ashes, and Black land ownership hit its peak in like 1910 to 1920, which is mind blowing, because this is less than or just about 50 years out from the end of the Civil War. It's, as we know, Reconstruction was not what it was supposed to be, so it's not like reparations actually happened. No one really got their 40 acres and a mule, and still so much happened. So in part 2, it's just about how Black people come to own land, Black churches, Black schools, Black like communal spaces and compounds and homesteads, and just like jumping into some of the ways that Black people own land. And the one thing I'll say here is that there's a few things that were kind of expected, which is that like typically biracial people were more likely to own land, because it's sort of like a white parent passes on land that would have normally never gone to a Black person. So the closer you were to whiteness, the more likely you were to own land. But then some things were unsurprising, like Black women were uniquely positioned to buy land, because Black women in the South, like post-Civil War, a lot of Black people just went into the same jobs in agriculture, and many as sharecroppers. But white widows of Confederate soldiers did not know how to upkeep their houses and their estates by themselves, and were hiring Black women to run their estates because they couldn't afford a full team. And so there was like this weird phenomenon where Black women start to get very, very wealthy by just taking on a bunch of white widow clients. And so there's a bunch of stories like that kind of show how we even came to owning a bunch of land, how places like Wilmington and Tulsa become Wilmington and Tulsa. And then part 3 is The Heist Revisited, which is, Black people are owning land again. It's time to snatch that from under them. And it goes into the different strategies that we use: eminent domain, heirs property, like discrimination, USDA discrimination, outright violence and massacres. Then part 4 is the outcome, which is to talk about the economic impacts on Black people and the environmental impacts. And then the take back is more late 20th century, early, where we are now, 21st century fights for Black people to get that land back. During the Civil Rights Movement, it didn't get as much visibility as like lunch counter movements and things like that, but Black people were fighting for land ownership alongside Indigenous Americans, but also individually, and fighting for reparations. And so we can see the moment we're in now as a continuation of that. So that is the table of contents.
And I like how you said the Great Migration and the Great Loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To repeat, so there's one chapter called The Great Migration and the Great Loss. And I think Isabel Wilkerson did a great job at doing a lot of this reframing. So I just tried to build upon things she had already said, which is to think of people who fled during the Great Migration as domestic refugees, and not just as people who moved for a job. It was really people fleeing with nothing but what they could carry. And thinking of the fact that based on the stats, some of those people had to have owned land and property, because in 1910 and 1920, we have these property rates that we still have not reached. We haven't gotten close to reaching as we did then. And so a lot of these people who are ending up in places like Detroit and Chicago and Newark and Oakland owned property and land at some point. But during the Great Migration, we have so much property and business loss and wealth loss. And it's like, if we only talk about the loss, it's like as if it vanished into thin air. It's like, oh, where'd the money go? It just like evaporated. And it's like, no, someone has that money and wealth. It's just not in the hands of the descendants of those people. And so if you were fleeing in the middle of the night because you got a ominous message in the mail that said you and your family had 24 hours to get out, you didn't have time to sell the family farm. You just left it there. And whoever was bold enough, often a white family, to move into the land that you left behind, then that was just theirs. And that happened really, really often. So just thinking of that, like how much we talk about how much the Great Migration changed the North and the West, but it really transformed the South too. That there were people left behind who just lost the strength in numbers and the wealth that was there.
And also, when you mentioned that, I was thinking about Louisiana with Katrina. They were telling me how a lot of people lost their homes because of the simple. Well, we think it's Big Mama's house and everybody goes there, but she didn't have a deed. She didn't have it like in writing, and so they couldn't. So when they went back to claim, they didn't have the paperwork, and so that's also a form of loss. Like they kind of lost that property because they don't have the proper paperwork.
But that is still, I'm gonna say, like, that is still theft because
That's still big time.
yeah,
Yeah,
because
that's what I'm saying. I mean, just
in a surveillance state like America, they don't have proof of who owns what. And like that happened again, like there's precedent for these things. In Wilmington, before they, and as at the same time as they're killing Black people, they're burning deeds at the courthouse so that there's no proof of who owns what.
Yeah.
That happened in Tulsa for sure too. And I think that in moments like this where it's like, well, if you don't have proof, then we don't got proof. And it's like, I feel like you have proof, but because I don't have it, you're like, well, you can't prove that I have, you know what I mean? Like it becomes one of those things, and the burden of proof should not be on us. Like the analogy that I use too, because when they talk about reparations, it's like, oh, well, we never prove who lost what and whatnot. And it's like, if I could do the tracing of my genealogical history, my government, who has the access to the records that I paid to get, should be able to do it. And it reminds me a lot of like the IRS. Like you're forcing me to tell you how much I owe when you know how much I owe you. Like, and I think that it just becomes an excuse of, well, if you don't have proof, then I don't have to produce, or I don't have to try my best. There's a lot of records that are not digitized that could be turned into microfilms and then made more accessible. And they just don't want it to be easy for us to find these stories, but it's still possible. And I think in places like Katrina, in New Orleans post-Katrina, it was very convenient because then these Black neighborhoods turn into parks that then get privately developed. And they're just, I think that similar things are happening in Houston. Is like this hope that one too many hurricanes comes through and people can't afford to rebuild and they are not eligible for certain FEMA loans, because this is like a random fact, but if you're an heirs property owner, like how I am in North Carolina, and a hurricane comes and affects your land, or tornado comes and hurts your land, because you're an heirs property owner, you're not eligible for any FEMA aid. So your house could be destroyed, the dam could be broken. What? And because you are an heirs property owner and they consider that a dirty deed, you cannot get any loans. So that's how people lose land too. And it's like then FEMA, you default and FEMA becomes the owner of. So like there's some weird loophole stuff that happens. And Naomi Klein aptly described it, disaster capitalism. This idea of when people are at their most vulnerable and in their, whether that's after a natural disaster, whether that's grandma just died, like when you're at your most vulnerable, there's someone coming in and using words that you're not totally familiar with, and you signed something you didn't look at enough because you're grieving or you're sad about what was taken from you, and now they have the house, and now they have the farm, and now they have the land. And that happens so often, which is why things like wills and trusts become so important, because thinking that society and the powers that be will do right by you just because you and your family are going through hard times is just historically not what has happened. And if we don't know that and don't say that, then we are, I don't even want to say it's naive, because you should get grace in these moments, but we are gullible enough to believe that we are going to be treated with the grace that we would give, and that's just not what happens. So,
were there any other questions from anyone?
oh yeah.
I wonder if I didn't get a chance to read the book in its totality, but I am. But I'm wondering if you cover the 5 civilized tribes and their theft of African American land and how they were supposed to give some of that back to enslaved Africans, but that never occurred. And one case where the Cherokees took the land back and said, "You don't have Cherokee blood, we don't care," and took the land. And it's in the present, and this was as recent as 2007.
Mhm.
So are we? I mean, a lot of times we look at the European, but it's a lot of people who have blood on their hands when it comes to African Americans land.
Yeah, I do talk about this in the book for sure, and it's definitely an important point to bring up. I think I try my best in the book to have a nuanced take on it for two reasons. One is that the US government spends so much time talking about the 5 civilized tribes because those are the 5 tribes that they decided to acknowledge and to negotiate with and to partner with. But there are hundreds of indigenous tribes and nations on the soil. So the 5 tribes did, I think, all with the exception of the Seminoles, engaged in the enslavement of Black people. And when they were removed from their lands, their enslaved Black people were removed with them during the Trail of Tears. And so that's very real. But that's 5 out of hundreds of tribes. And many other tribes, especially in the Midwest, were very abolitionist, refused because it just went against their whole way of being. So I talk about that often, but even the term 5 civilized tribes, like they use labels like that because they said, well, since the others don't want to work with us, they're uncivilized. And these 5 that have gotten used to our systems are going to be the ones that we acknowledge. So we talk about the Cherokee and the Iroquois and whatnot, but like those are not the majority of indigenous nations. But they were some of the biggest, and they were nations that profited from the enslavement of Black people. And when slavery was abolished, the frustrating part is like, I want to have an accountability conversation, but the challenge becomes that the U.S. has no moral standing to be a part of that. So the U.S. federal government was forcing tribes like the Cherokee Nation to give reparations to the people that they'd enslaved, even as they refused to give any reparations to the people that white plantations enslaved. So to punish indigenous nations, they would essentially were trying to force reparations on them, which I think all enslaved Black people on this land and in any other land across the Caribbean or whatever needs to get reparations. But again, it's like when a white colonizer comes in and is like, do the right thing. It's like, who are you talking to? Like, you do the right thing, and then I'll do the right thing. And I think it becomes a continuing to point fingers. So all that to say, there's a really important series about this called 40 Acres on a Lie. And I do think that people should watch that. And I do think there's a lot of work right now to address anti-Blackness in these indigenous nations, because yes, a lot of the tribes deny the Black tribal citizens their citizenship, which means that they don't get access to the healthcare or any other benefits in the reservations, but then they are freedmen. They are free peoples who were enslaved by indigenous people. So I do talk about that in the book. And I also talk about, like, for me, it's like, you know, when you were little and they're like, this is an A and B conversation, see a way out. It's like the federal government has no right to be a part of the conversation. Black and indigenous people should have a conversation about what it means to address anti-Blackness that indigenous nations have and anti-indigeneity that sometimes Black people have leaned into. I talk a lot about how Hampton University, an HBCU that is very, very beloved, was a part of trying to help assimilate indigenous people who were students in the beginning decades of the university. Buffalo Soldiers are another example, Black soldiers who are a part of helping to remove indigenous people. So it can go both ways, but so can the solidarity. And I think it just should be a conversation that we have with each other that says, for us to be in solidarity, you have to take accountability for this historic history and do right by those who are currently there, and vice versa. But I think that the federal government and white Americans kind of use that as a pawn to then keep us divided. And it's like, oh yeah, let's play this chess piece. So then right when Black people are talking about reparations, all of a sudden we're too mad at indigenous people to be fighting for the reparations, and vice versa. And it's like, I actually think that there would have been no reason for indigenous people to become complicit in enslaving Black people if their land did not be taken in the first place. Yeah. So if we talk about all of that white people should not have been here telling any of us what to do, then a lot of things would have looked different. But unfortunately, we have some tribes that did participate that, and they have to do right. But the majority of indigenous people in America are not from those 5 tribes. There are so many others, and when you think about that, it makes sense. Like when those nations were enslaving people, the U.S. was still in that corner of the East Coast. We hadn't even had Manifest Destiny in its full capacity yet. I don't even think we had done Louisiana Purchase yet. So, so I think owning that and saying that the scale of white enslavement of Black people was way larger than the scale of indigenous enslavement of Black people. So it's very bold for the government to think that, you know, and yeah.
And I think most nations have abolished blood quantum in the last like 10 years. So like most of them aren't even requiring like a blood quantum for people to come and be a part of the nation.
But sometimes it's like they say they abolished it and they're still doing it. And I've definitely seen instances of it happening. And it's always only in one path because mostly white indigenous Americans are like in leadership in the tribes. And so you look at this person who's calling themselves Chief Stone and you're like, okay. But a Black indigenous person is like having to fight so hard to prove their place in that society. So it does still happen. Like I don't want to dismiss,
right.
but
you're right. The Washington, whatever the name is currently, the guy that's in charge of formerly the Redskins is funneling like he's funneled like a few $100 million into certain tribes run by certain people to
Yeah.
I have part 2, I'm sorry.
No.
And this is really dealing with the current political affairs today. I know you touched on it when you touched on Black farmers, and I know this can be sensitive, and I know we got cameras all over the place. But what do you think the stance is of Black farmers? Because they don't really want to support the Democratic Party after what the Obama administration took. I think it was $12 billion, and then they got less than 1%. So they only got 50,000 and 5.7 billion went to what was it? Europeans, white farmers, and the micro lending they didn't get hardly less than 1% in the micro lending under the USDA. So I don't know. What do you think about their position, especially with the coming legislation that's going down? What do you think some of their demands should be in the history given here and their political experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think the demands that are being made are very valid, and I think, both parties have been really bad to Black landowners and Black farmers. So it's not something that I could hold against just one administration, especially because the Biden administration did just try to give $4 billion to Black farmers that white farmers then sued for reverse racism, and it was a Trump-appointed judge who was like, who's blocking it, and that the funding has not gotten out. So I think it's important to say that like in some areas they've tried, and in some areas not enough. And I think again it comes to like the pressure. I think there definitely needs to be more pressure that says we're not going to let Black farmers be like sold down the river sort of situation, and that it has to be enough of a priority in our national racial justice conversations for people to realize like, oh yeah, we're not going to be appeased by this one policy when that could do a lot of good. But I also think sometimes the terms of those court cases in general were not designed very well. So I think that a lot of, again, it's like a burden of proof thing. There's like statute of limitations, and you got to prove that you were discriminated against to activate and like access some of the funding. And I think it's just too much work. I think that Black landowners who still own land should get funding. I think Black people who don't own land should also get funding, because you could have and you would have if things had been different. And I don't think you should. Yeah, I think like there are a lot of families whose farms bankrupted or were already taken away that wouldn't be able to access it under the certain terms. So yeah, I just think there should be a lot more private and public efforts to get more money in. And even with a lot of my critiques, because I have a lot of critiques of the Democratic Party, Trump is not doing anything for Black farmers at all. And a lot of the like, not to get too like technical, but like a lot of the trade laws that he wants to support are going to hurt small farmers, because he wants to open that up in a way that will bring in more imports and undercut the already like abysmal, demand for local farmer stuff. Which is like, for example, like what we saw during COVID-19. The grocery stores are empty because we can't ship things in as fast as we did before, and people are realizing that nothing's grown locally. But when you don't subsidize and incentivize local farmers to be able to afford to compete, then they can't compete with Tyson. You know, like you can't compete with these big factory farms. So I just think that the Republicans don't want to regulate anything in support of us. That doesn't make their Democrats infinitely better, but I think I'd rather struggle with and campaign against them and the judges that they have put in, you know, than the judges that like the Republicans put in place. But very, very real, and a lot more is needed.
And it's my understanding
Very
that the
well
Trump
answered.
Thank
Very
you, I
thorough.
appreciate
Oh
you.
my God.
so brilliant, right? Like you don't even know. And it's my understanding the Trump administration also removed itemized deductions, which have also hurt farmers being able to go through and kind of say what was and wasn't shouldn't be counted towards their taxes.
And these are the little things that like you don't think going into an election cycle or when a law is being passed that's going to affect you. Like itemized, like what does that actually mean? Tariffs, trade, like what does any of that actually mean? But like it really boils down to the fact that they will subsidize dairy and all kinds of stuff, but they are not going to send any money to the small farmers who have to compete already against the machines and the pesticides and the chemicals and all this stuff. And it's really frustrating because even with, like you said, I mean, under the Obama administration, stuff like that happened. But this goes back before because the Pigford settlement was in the 90s. And so if Black farmers got the money that they should have got from that settlement, then hopefully we wouldn't be having this conversation. But so.
Oh man, I hope Michelle Kamala heard this conversation.
Someday. Well, I want to thank you so much, Brea, for all the time. I'm sure some other people have some questions they can ask you afterwards. But thank you so much for being here, for talking about this. You got my brain like moving so fast right now. If I had my phone, I'd be writing so many things because I have like so many things where I'm like, oh my God, this just reminded me of this. So thank you so much for this. Those of you who want to order the book, you can do so through her bio. Or you can order it from the Doc Bookshop. So and you can order online through
The Doc Bookshop?
the don't you guys? There's one more though, isn't there? The big website that also directs to you guys.
What's bookshop.org? Yeah.
Yeah, there's bookshop.org or just Doc Bookshop, so you guys can order this directly, get your own beautiful copy. And yeah, like it's been an amazing
And
conversation.
encourage
So
groups to get it, because I think groups can benefit by having this book and having group conversations.
Oh, yes.
So we need to encourage group conversation because she says so much powerful things that we have to go back and listen. Even talking about the visibility. Like I have this problem with the publishing company. They do East Coast, West Coast, and forget about bringing these high-profile books like yourself to the South, and we need to confront that. So we might have to clip that out of your stuff. And put it out.
Yeah. No, for real. Listen, if anyone sets up and does a book, like I'd love to be part of a book club conversation or you know, even come back in a virtual sense. But I appreciate you saying that. Thank you so much.
So if they
and
have
Danya said,
questions,
for those of y'all who couldn't hear it, she said order this in bulk for groups. So you guys can also order in bulk. And yeah, if you want to do that as well.
And just how do they contact you? And then I'm in my live.
Oh yeah, BreaBaker.com. I'm on social media at Freckles While Black. Thank you for your support and for tuning in.
Thank y'all. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. This was brilliant. There's so many things.